James Markham Hall Jr. here. The Content Monsters Network is expanding, and today we have a special treat for you from cinematographer and director DYLAN TRIVETTE. Whoa, that was a close call.
This is part 2 of the Canon C500 Mark II and Red Gemini comparison test. I wanted to focus on the noise levels when shooting in Canon Raw Light, XF AVC, and Red Raw. Let's begin with the Canon C500 Mark II in 5.9K, Raw Light, and an ISO of 800. Beginning at ISO 800, the Canon Raw Light is very clean, as it should come as no surprise considering this is the base ISO level for the Canon C500. At 1600 ISO, we can see by the waveform monitor and at 200% that there is more noise in the shadows. At 3200, I'm noticing more chromatic noise. At 6400, the chromatic noise is even more present. It's even starting to make its way into the midtones as illustrated on the waveform monitor. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the Canon Raw through the ISO range enlarged at 200%. And now on to the XF AVC of the Canon C500 Mark II. This is not a RAW file, so processing in camera has been applied to the image, which means we should see cleaner blacks, lower noise at higher ISOs. First up is ISO 800. Keep in mind that depending on the screen you're viewing this on, the contrast, the brightness, and the color may look different. Also, due to the nature of web compression and artifacting, I've included the waveform monitor to give us an idea of how the noise is affecting the image through the ISO range. And now at ISO 6400, I'm impressed by how clean the image looks at this high of an ISO. Here's a comparison of the XF AVC through the ISO range. Onto a Red Gemini. It's in 5K at a Red Raw with a compression of 5:1. Unique to the Red Gemini is a dual native ISO. Here we have our base ISO of 800. At 3200, we'll switch into low light mode. A technical note about the Red Gemini. Prior to this test, I performed a black shade calibration. Switching into low light mode at 3200 on the Red Gemini, the noise looks to be comparable to ISO 1600, a benefit of the camera's dual ISO sensitivity. At 6400, looking at the waveform, the noise has moved into the midtones, and the chromatic noise has become more amplified. And onto our comparison of the Red Gemini through the ISO range. A consideration as we watch this side-by-side comparison. The Canon Raw Light was shot in 5.9K, and the Red Gemini Red Raw was shot in 5K, meaning we're watching downsampled images on our 4K timeline. As I watch this side-by-side comparison, I'm paying special attention to the C500 Mark II Raw and XF AVC to see how the noise levels differ. Comparing the 3200 ISO of the XF AVC to the Canon Raw Light, I'm observing less chromatic noise than that of the Canon Raw. Even though the noise is apparent at ISO 6400, the noise is manageable, especially in programs like DaVinci Resolve. Let's take a quick moment and apply noise reduction to see how the images clean up. By applying just a little temporal and spatial noise reduction, these shots were easily adjusted. Now, let's apply a conversion LUT to these cameras to see how the LUTs perform at the ISO levels. On the Canon C500 Mark II in RAW and XF AVC, I applied a Canon Log 2 to BT 2020 conversion LUT. On the Red Gemini, I applied a Rec 2020 LUT with medium contrast and a very soft highlight roll-off. Something curious about the Canon C500 Mark II conversion LUT is that in RAW and XF AVC, the LUT appears to be performing differently, as we can observe in the skin tones and on the color chart, even despite both being shot in Canon Log 2. As we can see at ISO 3200, these LUTs are really cleaning up these images. Additionally, I haven't noticed any color shifts throughout the ISO range. One of the more interesting parts about this test is to see the quality and the texture of the noise from each of the cameras. Is it more organic or more digital? Is it more natural or more chromatic? Knowing this allows me to pick which camera is appropriate for which project.